So now it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker. So this is Corey Zimmerman. She's the Director of Policy and Scaling Strategies at the Harvard University Center on the Developing Child. As the director, Corey provides strategic leadership to the development of the innovation pipeline for the early childhood field, focusing on how to support intervention teams to transition to scalability. She also directs the center's strategy on how the science can be used to drive new ideas in policy and systems. Corey brings to this work extensive experience advocating and shaping social policy on behalf of young children and families from her prior work at United Way of Massachusetts Bay and Merrimack Valley, the Massachusetts Department of Early Education and Care, and the Nurtury, Inc. She holds a master's in human development and psychology from the Harvard Graduate School of Education and a BA in public policy analysis from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So join me in welcoming Corey back home.
So I'm going to take us on a journey, and it starts 19 years ago. I was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Governor Jim Hunt was leading a crusade for young children in this state. Investments in Smart Start were increasing, and you were showing the nation what it looked like. It was a model for what it looked like when public leadership chose to invest in early childhood. About the same time, my now boss, Jack Shonkoff, released this seminal report, Neurons to Neighborhoods. And it gave our field a new language and a scientific rationale for the importance of these early years. And myself and so many others have been on a journey ever since. We have been taking that brain science and heralding it as far and loud and wide as we could. We've been bringing it to state houses, to chambers of commerce, to governors' mansions, to town halls, all making the case for greater investments in the early childhood years. And we've been successful. There have been historic investments in early childhood in the past 19 years. They have been hard fought, they've been hard won, they've been historic, and they've been increasing, and they still are today. And yet, a troubling question started to come up. And we started to wonder, all of these investments that we were getting, if we invested them in our current programs, would they be enough? Would they be enough to reach the impact at scale that we were promising? So in the early 2000s, the center supported this study. It was looking at program evaluations from the last 50 years of early childhood center-based programs. And just to orient the graph to you, this is a picture of the results, and each of the dots represents a study that was looked at. The bigger the circle, the bigger the sample size. On the bottom is the years that the study was from, and going up the y-axis is the size of the effect, the magnitude of change for kids who are in the programs. And you find the zero line, and basically everything that's above the zero line means that there was a positive impact on kids and families. And what the data analysis showed was that, by and large as a field, we have proven that we can make a positive impact in the lives of kids and families. We have shown that repeatedly. And yet the size of that change is actually somewhat modest. It's sort of a moderate effect size in statistical terms. But more so, when they looked at the data, what they found was that these iconic studies in our field, Perry Preschool and Abecedarian, actually show that we can have larger impacts in the lives of kids and families. We can have a bigger effect, we can have a greater change, and yet we haven't been able to replicate those. We haven't been able to replicate them at scale. So we have a proof of concept. In business terms, this sort of proof of concept is we've shown it's possible to do this, but we've had limited impact at scale. This is from a more recent study that did a similar kind of look in pediatrics. And so the study authors looked at 48 different studies. It was of 24 different interventions. And they similarly were looking for change in child outcomes. And what they found was that actually most of them didn't make a change in child outcomes. Most of them were evidence-based because of change in parent outcomes. And what the study authors found was that there was a different child outcome measure actually that was used in each of the studies, making it a bit hard because everybody had a different definition of what a child outcome looked like. And actually that the results, there was so much heterogeneity, there was so much variation in the results that it was actually rather hard to tell which of the interventions were successful and which ones were not. So what the authors concluded was actually there's a need for better strategies and better metrics. So we at the center took a moment to step back and say, okay, this is where we are in the field. This is how far we've come on our journey. Where do we go next? What does the next leg of our journey look like? And so we looked to other fields. We looked to social entrepreneurship. That was a field that understands scale and how to bring things fast and furiously to large numbers of people. So we've been trying to look at that field and understand, as well as then look at the strengths of our field and understand how do we bring that back here. And so we returned to the science. Partly that's because that's who we are. We are really excited about the science. But also we were curious. The science had helped transform our field once before. And was there more to mine? Was there more there that we could find? And the science had been advancing in all that time. And so was there more that we could pull from there? And what we found was that, yes, actually, 21st century science does offer a compelling platform for science-informed innovation in early childhood policies and programs. And part of that was because it was helping us understand how and why things happen. So as a field for a long time, we've understood some kids experience effective learning, they have adaptive behaviors, they experience lifelong health and well-being, whereas another set of children experience school failure, they exhibit risky behaviors, they have chronic illness and shorter lifespan. And we've wondered why. Why is that happening? We have some sense that it's this combination of supportive experiences, it's their parents, it's their genes, it's experiences, it's what's happening. All of that kind of goes into this black box, and out come some kids in one direction and some kids in another direction. But here's the cool thing. The science is actually helping us explain how and why this happens. It's helping us understand that actually it's the combination of genes and experiences, that those things interact, and that's why some things turn out one way than the other. And we're going to keep exploring that as we go through. But if we understand how this works and how it happens, then we can change it, and we can build interventions that are based on that science. And actually, the science is helping us understand it all the way down at the molecular level. So we took this then to be our challenge for the next leg of the journey. It's to go beyond using the science to make the case for investments in early childhood, and to begin to use the science to design policies and programs that have greater impact. How? How is science going to help us achieve better outcomes? So we create policies and programs, and I'm so excited. Actually, this is a whole conference of system leaders and people who are excited about working at that level. So we create policies and programs, and this is a bit of an oversimplification, but let's go with it, to lead to healthy child development and thriving families. And we use as indicators of success. If our policy and programs they create access, create higher quality. We measure success of healthy child development around school achievement, economic self-sufficiency, good physical and mental health. But what the science is telling us is that actually what we need to start paying attention to is the experiences and conditions that are created by those policies and programs. That's the intervening factor. That's the factor that mediates if we get to those outcomes that we're all hoping for. And even more so, the science is helping us see that there are particular aspects of those experiences and conditions that are really important for us to pay attention to. And if we double down on these, they will help lead to the outcomes that we're all looking for. So I'm going to describe those three things as design principles as we go through, and I just wanted to take a minute to define what I meant by design principles. So this is a quote from the VP of Product Design for Facebook, and she describes, "The purpose of having design principles is to really align people around what matters. When push comes to shove and you have to make a trade-off, how are you in those moments going to prioritize? What are you going to care about the most?" So design principles is this term that comes from the tech field, and you can kind of think of them as like, they're your decision criteria. When you have to make a choice, which thing do you prioritize? Which thing do you decide to organize around and make most important? And those are what your design principles are. So the science suggests to us that there are three design principles to improve outcomes for children and families. They are build responsive relationships, reduce sources of stress, and strengthen core life skills. Now I want to pause and just acknowledge, if they seem simple, that means we did our job. Our job is to help translate the complexity of the science to make it simple. Simplicity is found on the other side of complexity. So we're going to talk about these and go through the science that's behind them, but I appreciate for those who've been in the field for a long time that this feels a little bit like, yeah, right, of course, these are the important things. But let's go through why they matter so much. The other thing I want to point out about these design principles is that they're interconnected, that they connect to each other. I'm going to present them as if they were three separate things that had their own bodies of science behind them. But really what you'll start to see is that by reducing sources of stress, that helps free up parents' bandwidth to be able to provide more responsive relationships. By strengthening our core life skills, that's a way to help reduce stress. So you'll start to see that they're actually interconnected, but we're going to talk about them a little bit separately. And the other part of it is that these apply as much to children as they do to adults. And so reducing stress and building relationship and skills is just as important for children as it is for the adults in their lives. And that includes teachers and home visitors and caseworkers. And it's a two-gen approach, right? So we know that what happens for children affects adults, what happens for adults affects children, and so we want to work on these things at both of those levels. All right, so let's dig in. The first one, build responsive relationships. So the science behind this one is that responsive relationships and positive experiences build sturdy brain architecture. Brains are built over time. You can think of it like building the foundation of a house. So you start, when you're building a house, you want a strong foundation, because everything else that you're going to put on top of it, the wiring, the walls, the plumbing, everything else rests on that foundation being strong. And when I talk about a strong foundation as it relates to a brain, what it means is literally the neural connections. The connections that are in the brain, you want those to be strong, because then that helps determine everything else that comes after it. Because brains are built from the bottom up, so you get simple tasks and connections before you get more complex ones. Brains are built over time. Blueprints, the genes are the blueprints. So you can think of our genetic code as like the blueprints for your house. So you have a plan, they're written up in the blueprints. Your genetic code is like that. It gives the instructions for what's supposed to develop when, what's supposed to come online after what. But what we'll start to see is that experiences actually influence how those genes are expressed. So you can think of it, you're planning to build a house, you've got your lumber all picked out, and then the price of it raises. That's a condition that changed. Now you got to re-scramble and figure out what to do. So your genes are your blueprints. And then the third part of this is that brains are actually built through serve and return. They're built through interactions with other people. So serve and return is an analogy like tennis, right? A child serves up an interaction, an adult or another child returns that interaction, and that's how brains are built, is through that responsive caregiving and that responsive interactions with the world. So next I'm going to show a video. We'll highlight several of the scientists that we work closely with, and it's going to talk a little bit more about serve and return and what happens actually in the absence of it.
Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
Under conditions where serve and return is broken, you literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging and cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development, certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Okay, so I want to reinforce one of the important takeaways out of that, and it's about why early matters. Why is doing this early important? And it's because of the brain's ability to change decreases over time. So this is a conceptual graph, and it shows your brain's plasticity over time. And plasticity is its ability to reorganize and adapt those neural connections in your brain. And why that matters is because early on, they're simple. You can see in the early years, there's a lot of plasticity. It's easy, it's able to reorganize those. But as things get more complex and it lays down more complex connections, it's harder to change those and harder to adapt those. And what I mean by harder is that it takes more physiological effort. It takes more effort to enhance and to redo those neural connections. So I want to appreciate everybody's looking for how old they are and where they are on that graph. We all do it, don't worry. So the thing to know is that the red line actually never hits the bottom. So the red line never zeroes out. If you are 100, and you learn something one day, and you wake up the next day and remember it, your brain is still plastic. It never hits the bottom until they pull the sheet over you, so you're good. It's just that over time it gets harder, so we can do it earlier when it's easier and the brain is more adaptable, or we can pay more later in terms of effort and time and costly remediations, but it is never impossible. And then this study comes to us from our colleagues in Oregon, and it was looking at how the critical component that relationships can play and help buffer that stress response system. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and what happens in typically developing and sort of the community in general is that your cortisol level will fluctuate over the course of a day. But typically, it's pretty much the same at any point in the morning. So from day to day, your cortisol level is pretty much at the same at any level. And so what you see here is that the community group, the control group, pretty much had a stable cortisol level. For children who were in the child welfare system and who had been recently removed from their homes and placed into foster care, what you see is that, as expected, it's disrupted. Their cortisol level is all over the place because it's unpredictable, their body doesn't know what to expect, it's chaotic, they're in a foster home. And in standard foster care, that didn't come back to baseline. So what you're looking for in this graph is how close this line and the next line I'm going to put up are to that original control group. You're looking for the difference in space between them. But then there was a treatment that was called multidimensional treatment for foster care. And what they did was actually provide a lot of support to the foster parents around relationships, around skill building. They provided support to the kids around skill building and therapy. They provided support to the schools to be able to help them. And all of it was focused around relationships. And what you see is with that group of children, actually they were able to bring their stress hormones and their stress system back down and have it look much more like that community control group. And so you were able to actually buffer the stress response system all through focusing on relationships. So I share this one as it's possible to do. We can do this as a field. So why these principles? Why is building responsive relationships important? For children, as we've been talking about, it promotes the healthy development of brain architecture. It helps reduce your biological stress system. It provides the buffering that's needed to prevent tolerable stress from becoming toxic. And we're going to talk more about this one actually in the next principle. For adults, relationships help provide that practical and emotional support, and they help build hope and confidence. So the other end of the spectrum, right, is if you don't have a lot of relationships, it's social isolation, it's depression. That's the other end of this spectrum. And being here at this end is where in relationship is what helps you provide that hope and confidence, the emotional support that help you actually buffer and weather your own stressful circumstances. It also is a place to be able to model and try relationship skills. A lot of these skills that we're going to talk about need to be practiced, and they need to be practiced in relationship with someone else. And so relationships are as important for adults as for kids. So then I want to offer a couple of policy and practice shifts that you can consider using these principles. And what you'll see as I go through them is that all of them are actually about extending time. And what are ways that you can extend time for people to have more time and space to be in relationship with one another? So we can provide workers and service programs with enough time to develop relationships. And that can be about reducing their other burdens. That can be about reducing paperwork. That can be thinking about caseloads. What are things you can do to help them have enough time to develop relationships with their clients? And then at the other side, we can prevent children from cycling in and out of programs. And so what are ways that we can change policies or rules to be able to help with the purpose of extending time that kids have in programs, to be able to focus on relationships? And that can be kids cycle in and out due to housing instability, involvement with child welfare, loss of child care subsidy. And what can we do to improve retention in child care and human services positions? So this is what helps get to thinking about compensation initiatives, professional development, benefits. It can also play into your hiring and thinking about how are you hiring based on a preference for people who have strong relationship skills, are able to be strong in the serve and return area. All right, let's move on to the next one. Reducing sources of stress. So the science behind this one is that toxic stress disrupts the development of brain architecture and other systems. And I'm going to provide for a moment sort of a taxonomy, sort of 3 levels of stress. Because not all stress is bad. We have sort of a culture that say all stress, it's all terrible. But actually, you want to think about that there's 3 levels of stress. And the first is positive stress. And so that's a toddler who doesn't get the cookie they want. And they are very sad and they're very angry and they really wish they could have that cookie. That is a normal level of stress. That is something that you need to learn how to deal with to be able to grow up and deal with the inevitable ups and downs of life. The next level is what we call tolerable stress. Tolerable stress can actually be pretty significant. It can be weathering a natural disaster. It can be the loss of a loved one. It can be a pretty significant experience in the life of a young child. But what's different about tolerable stress is that there is a caring and responsive adult who is able to help that child downregulate and bring that stress response system back down to baseline and calm it down. So it can be something that is very stressful, but it's the presence of that caring, responsive adult who is able to help that child bring their stress response system back down. And then the third level is toxic stress, and that's probably a term that's familiar to most in the field. Toxic stress is what happens when a child's stress system is activated. It's at that very high level of activation, and it's chronic. It is ongoing. So it's one thing to be stressed for a couple days. It's another to be stressed for weeks and for months and for years, and to have your stress system activated at that level. So it's both chronic, and there is an absence of a caring, responsive adult who is able to help that child bring it back down. And it's that that absence and that being at that extended period of time, which is what starts to lead to the brain adapting in different ways. That starts to lead to the deleterious effects of stress. So this next video I'm going to show is going to talk a little bit more about toxic stress and its effect on development.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
Okay, so I want to further extend the point about what happens in early childhood and how it leads to these effects that we still see in adulthood. This study comes to us from Dunedin, New Zealand, where they followed a cohort of babies for over 40 years. And one of the things, they looked at lots of things, one of the things that they were looking for was this biomarker of inflammation, which leads to a higher risk for heart disease. It's a predictor of a later risk of heart disease. And what they found was that in the control group, there was about a 17% of the population had this biomarker of inflammation. That's about sort of what it is in the average population. They found in the group that they were following that if you had experienced depression before age 32, that there was about a 25% chance, or about 25% of them had this marker for inflammation. That was actually known. There's a lot in the literature already that connects this connection between inflammation and heart disease and depression. What was new was that they found for the kids who had been maltreated as a child was that actually 32% of them had this biomarker for inflammation. And even further, for those who had experienced depression and had been maltreated as a child, nearly 40% of them had this marker for inflammation. And so it's reinforcing the point that what happens in early childhood gets in under our skin and has effects across our lifetime, and it affects our biology and our health later in life. And then I want to extend the point a little bit further just in connecting it to healthcare costs, and again, this sort of idea of it continues through our life. So these are some of the top most costly diagnoses in our country and what they cost us as a society. And what you see is that these are actually ones who all have their markers, or they're all connected to inflammation, which has that connection to early childhood. And then cancer is here a little bit lower. Okay, so why these principles? Why is reducing sources of stress important for both adults and kids? For children, it's about encountering fewer and briefer situations that trigger that extreme stress response. So what we're trying to do here, by reducing sources of stress, we're trying to have children encounter fewer of those situations where their stress response system is activated. And if they still do, we want those to be briefer and briefer situations. As we've been talking about, it directly promotes brain development, health, and well-being. For adults, reducing stress is about opening up their bandwidth to promote the healthy development of children. So you can think all of us have, right, sort of a limited amount of bandwidth that we can focus on things, and if a large portion of that is taken up by handling something that's very stressful, then we have less available to be able to give and focus on the young children in our life. So by reducing sources of stress, we're opening up bandwidth to be able to free folks up to be able to focus on promoting the relationships with kids. We'll see a little bit more about this one in the next one, but actually reducing sources of stress enables more effective problem solving, planning, and goal achievement. Those executive function skills in particular are very susceptible to stress and can be sort of taken over and sidetracked by stress. And then just more opportunities for responsive caregiving. So a few policy and practice shifts using these principles. Reducing barriers to families, accessing basic supports such as nutritious food, safe shelter, diapers, medical care, and mental health services. So that's a way of reducing sources of stress. And actually, two things I want to point out. One, I actually think this principle is particularly cool for system leaders. So this is something we can do things about, right? We can help reduce the external sources of stress for families. What are ways that we can build policies and systems that actually are intentionally trying to reduce stress on families? The other one I want to call out in this one is around diapers. So this comes to us from work in New Haven with the Moms Partnership, and they had done sort of deep ethnographic and survey work with the moms in their community, and particularly they focus on depression, and they were asking the moms about what can we do, what would be helpful, what are sources of stress in your life, and diapers came up. And so the moms explained, first, you need a week's supply of diapers to be able to put your kid in childcare. And so if I don't have those, I can't enroll my kid. And the second was the shame associated with, I know my kid's in a dirty diaper, but I'm trying to stretch my supply, and I don't have enough, and I know that's not what I'm supposed to be doing as a mom. This is fixable. We can do something about this. And so they have a diaper bank in New Haven, and that's part of now the services and what they offer. But these ways of trying to think about and understand how can we reduce sources of stress in families' lives. The second is providing services in well-regulated and welcoming environments. And so thinking about the environment that families are coming into, whether that's the entry to your early education program or it's a benefits office, how is that in and of itself a welcoming place that's not an additional source of stress in a family's life? And the third one is thinking about establishing streamlined rules for eligibility and recertification, trying to find ways to minimize the punitive regulations that just add stress to families' lives. All right, on to the third one, strengthening core life skills. So these set of skills, they are core capabilities that we actually use for school, for work, and for parenting. And the skills that I'm talking about here, they're executive function and self-regulation skills, and they constitute a foundational set of capabilities that help us focus and sustain attention. They're the skills that help us set goals, make plans, and monitor actions. They help us make decisions and solve problems, and they help us follow rules, control impulses, and delay gratification. So these are the set of skills that you can imagine a child uses both when they're sitting in a classroom so that they don't poke their neighbor. They're the thing that's inhibiting that response of wanting to kick and play and poke their neighbor. It's also the set of skills that each of us uses every morning to get up, be able to get ourselves to work on time, figure out which set of projects need to go first. They are this foundational set of skills that all of us use in school, we use them in work, and we use them in parenting. But what's really interesting to me about them, we're not born with these. They have to be practiced. They have to be built. And they have to be built in relationship with someone. And so an adult needs someone else to practice them with and to have them scaffolded so that they can grow and develop them. And we describe these skills like an air traffic control system in your brain. So it's the set of skills in your brain that are actually paying attention to all the incoming stimulus and trying to decide which of it to pay attention to, which of it to respond to, which are the things that you didn't quite go the way you thought it was going to go, so you need to make a plan B, and all of that monitoring. So this video is going to talk a little bit more about how executive function skills develop.
How does executive function develop?
6, 7, 7, and plus 4.
In little children, and even, in the infant and toddler years, you begin to see the roots of executive functioning skills. What's going on in our brains is unbelievably intricate and complicated.
The prefrontal cortex, or the front third of the brain, is important for executive function. But it's more than just prefrontal cortex. This region doesn't act alone. It's involved in controlling your behavior through its interactions with all other parts of the brain. The brain goes from a situation where you've got nearest neurons communicating very strongly with each other and ignoring the rest of the brain, to these widespread networks that are connecting these different areas. Executive function changes over the life course. It improves radically over the first few years.
I got a match prime.
It continues to improve throughout adolescence. It's not until early adulthood that you have the adult-type networks that are very strongly activated that connect different brain regions together.
Let's take notes.
Also, we believe that executive functions can be trained.
It's just like going to the gym. So the more you practice in these areas, the stronger the capacity is likely to become because you're helping to strengthen those neural connections.
Okay, so I want to pull forward a couple points. So executive function skills develop across your lifespan. This, again, is sort of a conceptual graph, but they develop across our lifespan. And there's two places where they actually have really rapid growth. So the first one, as Dr. Bungay was explaining, in the beginning, as our brain's developing, all the individual regions of our brain need to develop. But then executive function skills are when those areas start to be able to connect to each other, and that happens around age 3. The brain is mature enough to do that. But what I find really fascinating actually about these critical periods for development of these skills is that it means they are very susceptible to what's happening in the environment at that period. So the genetic code says, all right, now's the time. It's time for the brain to grow and to do this. But they're very susceptible to experiences, which is both a pro and con. So that means that it's an opportunity where you can scaffold those skills, you can help them grow and develop, you can help strengthen them. But it also means that if kids are experiencing stress in that period of life, it will equally influence the development of those. So there's key periods of growth between the ages of 3 to 5, and then again from 12 to 21. Okay, so I've been talking for a while, so we're gonna do a little interaction. This is called the pencil tap test, and it's a test of cognitive flexibility and inhibitory control. And what's gonna happen is that I am going to tap well, it's actually a highlighter, not a pencil, but I'm gonna tap my pencil. When I tap it once, you, if you have a pen in your hand, or you can use your fingers, tap twice. When I tap twice, you tap once. Okay, is everybody ready? All right, here we go. Oh, maybe I'll do it on here. Good. All right. I woke everybody up a little bit. So here's what's interesting. Your average 3-year-old can't do that, but your average 5-year-old can. And it's about being able to inhibit your responses and plan for them. So the first time I saw that done in a conference, there's actually 2 things that really struck me about it. One, it actually takes effort to concentrate. You actually have to pay attention to it. And what that tells us about those skills is that they require physiological effort. It actually takes energy in your brain to use these skills. And so it's one you've probably felt before. You've really been focusing on something, and your brain starts to get tired, and you need to take a break and walk away and let those skills replenish. That is true. These skills take energy, and energy can be depleted, but then energy can also be replenished. So they take effort. And the second is actually that they're trainable, right? So after a couple seconds there, everybody sort of had it. They had figured out how to train their brains to pay attention to it. And this is the other point, that these skills, executive function and self-regulation skills, are trainable. As Dr. Phil Fisher was saying, it's like going to the gym. They are skills, you can build them. Okay, let's keep going. Actually, we're going to geek out a little bit more about executive function and self-regulation for another minute. So what I want to point out is that in these skills, there's 2 parts of it. There's automatic self-regulation, which is the part that happens, your body and your mind is monitoring all the time incoming stimulus. And so there are some things that your body chooses to react to that never reaches your level of conscious. It's happening, it's automatic. And then the other part of it is intentional self-regulation. And this is the part which raises to your conscious level, and it's where you actually make a choice about a plan, you decide which option you're going to take. And there are reasons for both, right? So if you needed to run away from a lion, you want your body to just react. You don't want to stop and think about that. You just want to run away from the lion. However, in negotiating something with your coworker, you actually want to pause and think and make a few decisions and decide about it. So why I bring those up is because stress actually affects the development of those and affects them in different ways. So as a young child, actually let me pause. So this is a picture of a young kid. I love our comms department, and it took me a little while to figure out this was not like fingers crawling across the stage, but it's actually the body of a child, and that's the head. Okay, just in case anyone else was confused by it. So what you see is that when you're developing, if you are living in a situation that's particularly stressful, it is very adaptive for your automatic self-regulation to become strong and to respond quickly. And if that side of it is constantly reinforced, it will grow stronger, and it will be the side that responds first. In some environments when you're growing up, that is highly adaptive. If it is not a safe environment or not chaotic, it is much better to be able to respond quickly. That's an healthy adaptive behavior. Why that becomes a problem is if later in life you are no longer in that circumstance, that adaptive behavior may then no longer be adaptive in the new situation. As an adult, you may come into adulthood with perfectly well-balanced automatic and intentional self-regulation. But similarly, as an adult, if you are in a stressful situation, your automatic self-regulation will take dominance. It will be the thing that kicks in further because stress swamps these skills. So you can think about it as sort of if you perhaps are preparing for a big speech, don't ask me to recite my grocery list right now. Like it's the kind of things that stress sort of takes over and it focuses on and it dominates one set of skills. So it affects both development and your deployment of those skills. But there are things we can do to strengthen and restore these capabilities. There's both things as an individual you can do, and there's things we can do in the environment. So as an individual, things that we can do is we can provide training to those specific skills aligned to the context in which they will be used. I always think a really cool example of this is a program that works with parents who have been in the child welfare system, and when they're reuniting with their kids, they actually take them to the grocery store. And they practice what executive function and self-regulation looks like while you're walking through the grocery store with your kids, which I just feel like is an entirely different example than talking about what these skills look like and like sitting in a classroom talking about them and actually being in the grocery store with your children. So practice them in the context in which they will be used. You can teach strategies for recognizing and interrupting automatic responses. Those are the kind of things of like pause, take a minute to breathe, and then decide, because you're giving that intentional self-regulation a moment to kick in and to be able to pick a better decision. And then there are things we can do in the environment. So we can streamline applications, forms, and processes. We can create accessible materials in many formats. And we can use clear language and break things down, tasks into steps. So why these principles? Why strengthening core life skills? Why is that an important one? For children, it's a set of skills that support educational and social success. It's also the set of skills they're going to use as they move into adolescence, but really their whole life, to resist decisions that risk health. For adults, these are the set of skills that you use to thrive in the workplace. It helps you also better be able to provide responsive care if you can be in the moment with your child and sort of really paying attention as a teacher, home visitor, parent. You can better be able to maintain predictable and supportive, safe environments. And for both, these set of skills promote the belief in the ability to affect change. So a key part of believing that you can make change in your life is called self-efficacy. And that's what's needed to be able to make long-range goals and plans. And these set of skills are part of that. And so you need to believe that your actions in the world will make a difference. And by doing that, it's called self-efficacy, and that's what moves you forward into wanting then to set long-range goals and plans. And these set of skills are the same ones that help you also better be able to manage stress. So some policy and practice shifts using the principles. We can prioritize funding for programs that provide opportunities for participants to practice these skills. We can include executive function and self-regulation as a key strand in the braided rope of skills that children need. So we talk a lot about literacy skills and numeracy skills, but we can also think about and prioritize executive function and self-regulation skills, because those are the skills that underlie and help one succeed in a classroom. We can focus on small incremental steps. So this is a practice suggestion around small incremental steps with frequent feedback. So a way to scaffold and help someone build their executive function skills is by breaking things down into small tasks and helping them build them up. So not saying go find housing, but sort of what's the first form you need, who's the first person you need to call, how are you going to move that forward, and breaking it down into smaller steps. All right, so resilience. I think resilience is really cool because it actually pulls all three of the principles together. So we'll start to see in this one where all three of the principles start to play. So I'm going to define resilience as it's an adaptive response to serious hardship. And what resilience looks like, it's evident when a child's health and development is tipped in the positive direction, even if there's a heavy load on the negative side. So we talk about resilience as sort of looking like a scale or like a teeter-totter. And you want to have more positive outcomes. You want their life experiences to tip towards positive outcomes. And you're trying to figure out how do we get in that balance of experiences that a kid has that it will tip towards the positive outcomes. And what we can do is we can provide protective experiences and adaptive skills. And so what you see is that actually things like helping kids increase their sense of mastery, that sense of self-efficacy, by providing supportive community response services, responsive relationships. And actually the literature says faith and cultural traditions is helpful in helping tip the scale towards those positive outcomes. But here's what's really interesting too, is that fulcrum sets how that scale tips. And so the fulcrum is our own traits, our own characteristics, which are expressions of our genetic differences. And everybody's fulcrum is placed in a different spot. But it's movable. You can actually change where your fulcrum is. It is never locked. It will move throughout your lifetime depending on the skills and experiences that you have. And you can actually try to strengthen it by adaptive skills. And so this is why it brings in the core life skills. By strengthening our skills, we can actually help build resilience. And so the last two pieces I want to add about this are that one, resilience is not an inborn trait. It's not something people are born with. It is always a combination of your your own genetics and the experiences that you have, and we can do things to help weigh so that those will weigh towards the positive outcomes. And in all the stories, you also always see that there is a supportive, responsive adult. It is not somebody by themselves, but there is always a supportive, responsive adult in that story of why someone is able to be resilient. So this next video and the last one is going to talk a little bit more about resilience and then what we can do in communities around resilience.
Resilience is not some magical quality. It's something that really can be built, even in difficult circumstances.
The key active core ingredient to building resilience are the relationships kids have to others who care about them.
Of course, families play a very important role, but nobody raises children in isolation. We have a huge amount of research to show the powerful impacts of teachers, coaches, other adults in the community with whom children have a chance to develop relationships, who play that critical supportive role of building resilience. As a result of responsive interaction, children build simple skills of coping and adapting. how to stop crying, how to regulate your behavior, being able to defer gratification.
You have an adaptive toolkit that allows you at moments of stress or challenge to bring out a number of potential skills that allow you to get through it.
As children get older, the sophistication of those skills increases. Being able to monitor situations, to solve problems. The way we as a society can nurture the development of resilience is to help communities to pay more attention to building the capabilities of the adults who care for children and provide the supports they need to tip the scales toward more positive life outcomes.
And then when communities say, we want to be an active part of crafting the solution to really understand what's necessary to produce the resilience, that's when the ball gets rolling.
Resilience building, capacity building, is really in everyone's interest, and everyone reaps the benefits when we do that well.
So I was excited to see actually in your recent early childhood action plan that resilience plays a role in there, and a prominent role. All right, so as we draw to a close, applying science-based design principles is to help you not just change systems, but to change lives. As we've been talking about, the systems, the programs, and practices create conditions and life experiences that get under the skin, that affect our biology, and we have the ability to change those. So I hope that you'll use these principles as a North Star to guide your program improvement. You can think of them as targets on your pathway to that, to the outcomes that we all ultimately want to achieve. So as you use science to design improvements, I want to leave you with a couple of questions you can talk about with your neighbor, or bring back home with you, or talk about with your team. The first is, how can these principles provide a common language and goals across your coalition of partners? How can our plans better support responsive relationships, core life skills, and decreasing stress in children and adults? And what's an area for action that has the greatest potential to increase impact for young children and families? Because all of this is about trying to improve their lives and trying to reach breakthrough outcomes for the children and families that we all care for and are responsible for. Thanks.